The base was alive with the usual chatter of boots striking concrete, the smell of diesel fuel from armored trucks, and the metallic clang of rifles being checked before another round of drills, but among the sea of hardened men and women in uniform, one figure drew more whispers than salutes. She walked with steady steps, her posture perfectly balanced, but every eye seemed to watch her with a mixture of curiosity and derision, because she did not look like the type who belonged in a battle-hardened unit known for its ruthless efficiency and relentless pace. Her hair was tied back too neatly, her uniform seemed almost too spotless, and her eyes, calm and cold, gave away nothing of the storms that might have raged beneath. To them, she was the outsider, the recruit pushed into their world of mud, sweat, and iron, and soldiers who had bled together in places where screams never left the air did not easily welcome strangers. They called her soft, they laughed when she failed to join their offhand jokes, and even during weapons drills, though her hands were precise and her stance disciplined, some whispered that she was only here because of connections or favoritism. No one knew her history and no one cared to ask. All they saw was someone too silent, too calm, and in their eyes, untested. The sergeants barked at her with double the venom, the younger soldiers mocked her behind her back, and even the veterans smirked when she tried to keep up with their brutal pace in obstacle runs. And yet she did not flinch, not once. Her lips remained sealed, her stride remained even, her eyes remained sharp. The mocking only grew louder because nothing frustrates the restless more than a target who refuses to break, but in her silence, there was something unnerving, something none of them could place. They mistook it for weakness when in truth it was restraint. Days turned into weeks, and the teasing sharpened into open scorn. She was left for last at mealtime, her gear was sometimes misplaced by mischievous hands, and in the barracks her name was often replaced with cruel nicknames. She bore it all with the same stillness, her patience like the coiled body of a serpent waiting for the right moment. The men and women around her could not see it, but the colonel who commanded the unit saw everything, and he chose not to intervene. He had eyes that measured soldiers the way a hunter measures prey, and though he watched the growing cruelty, he waited. He was waiting for the moment when silence would shatter. That moment came one night during a night march through the thick forest outside the base. The unit was tasked with a simulation exercise, capturing a target before dawn, and the ground was uneven, littered with roots and slick with recent rain. One soldier, trying to prove a point, deliberately shoved her aside at a crossing, sending her sliding down a muddy slope. Laughter erupted from the squad, but the sound died when she rolled onto her feet like liquid shadow, her rifle steady, her eyes gleaming with a sharpness no one had seen before. No word escaped her lips, but something in her stance silenced the night. The march continued, but whispers spread, unease replacing mockery. Later, when the squad bungled a silent advance and gave away their position, it was she who dissolved into the treeline, reappearing moments later behind the enemy post, having flanked them in near silence. She dismantled the target defenses with swift, precise strikes, moving like a predator in the dark. When the whistle blew, marking the end of the exercise, the unit gathered, panting and confused, but the colonel's eyes were fixed on her. As they stood in line, mud streaked across their uniforms, rifles heavy in tired hands, he approached her slowly, his voice carrying only to those nearest, and the words made the air around them colder than the night. "That's Black Viper," he whispered, just loud enough for it to ripple through the ranks. The mocking faces turned pale, the laughter that once filled the barracks echoed in their ears like shame, because every soldier knew the legend of Black Viper. The ghost operative, the shadow in classified files, the assassin whose name was never spoken without respect or fear. The silence of the forest seemed to press on their chests as realization struck, and for the first time, they saw not an outsider, not a recruit, but the woman who had walked through hells they could not even imagine, wearing scars not on her skin but in the stillness of her soul. And she said nothing because her silence was louder than any boast, her calm sharper than any blade, and her presence, now unmasked, heavier than all the weight of their scorn. The revelation did not explode like a burst of thunder. It settled like a heavy fog, slowly suffocating the arrogance that had once filled the unit, and in that silence, every soldier who had laughed at her felt the sting of their own ignorance. She returned to the barracks that night without a word, her boots carrying her steady steps over the same ground where they had once tried to trip her eyes brushing past the same faces that had smirked at her silence. And though no one dared meet her gaze now, she did not look for it. She unpacked her gear in the same quiet rhythm, placed her rifle by her bed with the same calm hands, and slept without the faintest sign of disturbance, but around her, whispers churned, memories of cruel jokes now tasting bitter in their throats. The name Black Viper was not one spoken lightly in military circles. It was the kind of code name that lived in the shadows of classified reports, whispered in mess halls by veterans who had fought in wars unacknowledged on paper, the kind of name that carried stories of operations so clean, so surgical, that no enemy ever knew what struck them until the silence after. They remembered tales of a lone operative who could infiltrate fortresses without a sound, who could end wars before they began by removing keystones from the enemy's chain of command, and who always left behind no trace but fear. None of them had imagined that the quiet woman they mocked could be the same legend that officers themselves spoke of in lowered tones. The change in the air was subtle at first. Greetings grew stiff, hands that once shoved now stayed respectfully at their sides, and the mocking laughter that once echoed was replaced by awkward silence whenever she entered a room. Yet she carried herself as if nothing had changed, still refusing to seek attention, still speaking only when necessary, and still observing with the same cold patience that had unnerved them before. It was not forgiveness she offered them, nor was it vengeance. It was indifference, a quiet acknowledgement that their opinions had never mattered in the first place. The colonel, however, knew better than to let the revelation settle into rumor. The following morning, when the sun broke across the parade ground and the unit assembled in rigid lines, his voice carried across the air like a hammer striking steel. "You think war is a place for pride, for gossip, for cruelty," he barked, his eyes sweeping across their faces, lingering on those who had been the loudest in their mockery. "You mocked a soldier whose silence is worth more than your voices combined. You think your scars make you strong, but you cannot see the scars carried by one who has walked in shadows deeper than you can fathom. Black Viper does not need your respect. She has earned the respect of nations. It is you who need to earn the right to stand beside her." The words sank like lead into their chests, and shame clung heavier than any pack on their shoulders, but he offered no reprieve, no chance to escape the weight of their actions. Instead, he ordered them into drills harsher than they had known, pushing them to the limits of exhaustion, forcing them to stumble and collapse in mud while she moved with the same steady precision, her body a testament to discipline honed beyond ordinary endurance. As the days turned, their scorn transformed into admiration, not because of fear alone, but because they saw with their own eyes the gulf that separated them from her. When they faltered on the obstacle course, she was the one who finished it twice without complaint. When they gasped for breath on long marches, she was the one who carried her pack as though it weighed nothing. When weapons jammed in the rain, her hands moved with a calm that fixed them in seconds, her shots ringing true when they're scattered wide. Slowly, grudgingly, the jeers that once followed her were replaced with quiet attempts to learn, to copy her methods, to seek her guidance without daring to ask directly. She gave nothing freely, only the occasional sharp correction, a glance that told them what they did wrong, a word that sliced through hesitation. But in those rare moments of instruction, they felt what it meant to stand in the presence of mastery born not of talent alone, but of battles survived in silence. Nights grew quieter too, the barracks heavy with reflection as stories of Black Viper's past began to surface, pieced together from fragments known to veterans in other divisions. They spoke of her missions in mountain ranges where blizzards swallowed entire battalions, of cities where enemies vanished in the dark without explanation, of commanders who owed their lives to a shadow they never saw. The unit that had once mocked her now lay awake wondering how many ghosts walked beside her, how many faces haunted her silence, and whether the coldness in her eyes was carved from all the blood she had spilled to protect the very uniform they now wore. And though respect grew where mockery had died, there remained an unease, a reminder that she was not simply one of them, she was something more, something they could not reach, something that stood as both protector and warning. The weeks that followed brought not peace but trials, for the colonel was not a man to let respect linger in theory. He believed soldiers earned their worth only when fire pressed against their skin, and so he pushed the unit into an operation that would test every bone they carried. It was meant to be a simple reconnaissance mission deep into hostile terrain, a chance to gather intelligence on a rogue militia that had been destabilizing villages with raids and ambushes, but simplicity in war was a lie that even the youngest soldier should have known better than to trust. They moved through the wilderness with heavy packs, rifles clutched close, nerves on edge, but the forest was not silent. It was alive with danger, the whisper of leaves masking footsteps, the rustle of branches hiding eyes that watched them from the dark. For the first 2 days the mission unfolded as planned. They set up camp, sketched maps, noted enemy movements from afar, and their spirits grew lighter, thinking perhaps this would be no more than a test of patience. But on the third night, as the moon spilled pale light over the treetops, the first bullet cracked through the air, shattering that illusion. Chaos erupted as gunfire tore into their position, dirt and splinters flying as enemy fire pinned them down, and panic surged through the younger recruits who had never known the taste of real combat. Commands overlapped, rifles jammed, and the line threatened to break, but in the maelstrom of noise her voice rose, not loud, not panicked, but sharp, precise, cutting through the chaos like steel through cloth. "Left flank cover. Eyes up, move with the trees, not against them," she barked, her calmness steadier than the colonel's own shouts, and for the first time they felt the weight of her presence not as a shadow but as a commander carved by necessity. She slid through the firefight like smoke, her rifle an extension of her breath, her movements economical and deadly, each shot silencing a threat before it fully emerged. Where the others scrambled, she anchored them, positioning soldiers with gestures, correcting their mistakes in seconds, and every order she gave brought them closer to survival. The militia had numbers but they lacked precision, and against her coordination their advantage crumbled. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity before the shooting eased, leaving behind only the acrid stench of gunpowder, the groans of the wounded, and the suffocating silence that followed death. The unit had survived, but only barely, and when dawn broke they saw clearly what had been hidden in darkness. Their enemy had been better prepared than intelligence suggested, their positions fortified, their traps laid with cunning. This was no mere skirmish. They had stumbled into a hornet's nest and retreat was no longer an option. Fear gnawed at them, exhaustion clawed at their strength, and yet she remained the same, calm, silent, unflinching. When others questioned the colonel's orders, when doubt threatened to break the unit into fragments, it was her gaze that steadied them, her voice that cut through uncertainty. She did not speak of glory, she did not speak of courage. She spoke only of survival, of the next step, of the path through danger carved not by hope but by skill. And they listened, because in the memory of last night's firestorm, they had seen her stand between life and death, and she had chosen for them to live. Over the next days she led them through ambushes and counterstrikes, guiding them with instincts honed in wars they would never read about. She taught them how to move unseen, how to silence their panic, how to let the forest swallow them instead of expose them, and slowly, piece by piece, they began to move not as a fractured unit but as a hunting pack. Her silence became their language, her gestures their signals, her calm their shield, and though fear remained, it no longer ruled them. The colonel watched, silent himself, for he knew that no lecture, no punishment, could have taught them what they were learning under her shadow. At night, when the fire burned low and the wounded slept under makeshift bandages, some dared to ask her questions, not about her past for that was still a forbidden subject in their minds, but about technique, about survival, about the small details that had kept them alive. She answered only in fragments, her words clipped, her eyes distant, but every lesson carried the weight of truth written in blood. They began to see her not as a ghost of legend, not as a figure larger than life, but as the very reason they still breathed, and that realization bound them to her in a way mockery never could. Yet, as the mission stretched into its second week, as exhaustion grew heavier and food scarcer, whispers of unease returned, for it became clear that their enemy was hunting them with equal ferocity. Tracks appeared near their camps, traps set in their paths, signals hidden in the trees. The militia was not simply scattered fighters, they were organized, intelligent, ruthless, and they wanted the intruders' heads. And though the unit had begun to transform under her guidance, the shadow of doubt returned in the dead of night when the forest itself seemed to close in. It was then, in those long hours when silence carried the weight of fear, that they understood why she was called Black Viper, not for speed, not for poison, but for patience, for the cold stillness that waits, unblinking, until the strike is absolute. The forest had become a cage, every rustle of leaves a warning, every bird's sudden silence a reminder that death could be watching from any direction, and the unit learned quickly that sleep was a fragile luxury, stolen in moments too brief to dream. They moved as shadows, their faces drawn, their bodies weary, but still her presence cut through despair like a blade through fog. She moved at the head of the column without hesitation, her senses tuned to dangers they could not see, her hand raised before they even realized a trap was near, her rifle steady when unseen eyes watched from afar. On the fourth night of their entrapment, as the moon lay hidden behind clouds and the air was thick with anticipation, the militia struck again, this time with a precision that betrayed knowledge of their route, and in the chaos of grenades shattering the night and bullets slicing through trees, the unit scattered into smaller groups, the discipline they had fought to learn unraveling under the sheer ferocity of the assault. Panic threatened to drown them, but her voice, steady as stone, called them back, her commands delivered not in shouts but in cold, sharp tones that sliced through the noise. She moved through the gunfire like she belonged to it, her presence a contradiction to fear, and though the night was torn with screams and explosions, she guided them into formations, pulled the wounded to cover, and struck back with a precision that unnerved even the militia. She was not fighting as one soldier among many, She was fighting as if she were the anchor upon which the survival of all depended, and though the others bled, though they faltered, they clung to her steadiness as drowning men cling to air. By dawn the forest was painted in silence, the ground littered with the bodies of their pursuers, but victory carried no joy, for the cost had been high. 3 of their own lay dead, and several more wounded so severely they could not continue without slowing the unit to death. The colonel's face was stone, his eyes heavy with the weight of choices no leader wished to make, but before he could speak she stepped forward, her calmness unbroken even as blood streaked her uniform. "We move the wounded north," she said flatly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "There is a ridge there. Defensible. If we stay on this path they'll trap us again." For a moment even the colonel hesitated, but he saw the certainty in her eyes, the certainty of one who had lived long enough in shadows to know when an enemy was closing its jaws. They followed, not because of rank, but because she spoke with the authority of survival, and the ridge became their salvation, a high ground from which they could defend, regroup, and plan. Days bled together as they held that ground, ambushing those who hunted them, striking with ruthless efficiency taught by her silent gestures, until the militia's confidence faltered and their attacks grew hesitant. Yet for the unit, the greatest battle was not against the enemy outside but against the shadows within. Exhaustion carved into their bones, grief for their dead weighed heavier than their packs, and whispers of failure haunted them in the dark. It was in those moments, when despair pressed hardest, that she revealed glimpses of the person behind the name Black Viper, not through stories of her past for she never gave those but through her actions. She sat with the wounded, binding their injuries with the same care she cleaned her rifle. She shared her rations with those who had none left, eating less herself without complaint. When a young recruit shook uncontrollably after his first kill, she placed a hand on his shoulder, her silence speaking what no words could. That fear did not make him less, it made him human, and survival meant carrying that fear without letting it break him. These small moments, unnoticed by outsiders, became lifelines for the unit, stitching them together with threads stronger than any lecture or order could have. And yet, though they drew closer to her, she never drew closer to them. She remained a shadow even in daylight, her eyes distant, her silence deeper than any bond they offered, and in that distance they began to understand that her life had never been hers, it had always belonged to the missions, the shadows, the ghosts of battles fought in silence. She was not simply their protector, not simply their teacher, she was something else, something apart, and though they respected her, even loved her in their own way, they could not bridge the gulf that separated them from the legend she embodied. Still, when the time came to break from the ridge and make their final push back toward safe territory, it was her plan that led them, her traps that slowed the enemy, her decisions that carved the path through danger. She led them through swamps where even footsteps could betray them, across rivers where silence was life, through ambushes turned against the ambushers, until at last they saw the faint glow of Allied outposts on the horizon. But even then, as relief threatened to soften their steps, her gaze was sharp, her stance rigid, for she knew the most dangerous strike often came when survival seemed assured. And she was right, because the final ambush was waiting, larger and deadlier than all before, and this time, there would be no easy escape. The horizon that had promised safety betrayed them, for the glow of the Allied outpost was no beacon of rescue but the bait of a carefully set trap. And as the unit descended from the ridge with tired steps and hope cracking through their exhaustion, the night itself seemed to split open with fire. Mortars roared first, earth exploding in fountains of dirt and flame that sent men and women sprawling, followed by the harsh staccato of machine guns hidden in the tree line, their tracers ripping through the dark like burning whips. Panic surged again, sharper than before, because this time there was no forest to disappear into, no ridge to hold. The clearing left them exposed, and the militia had prepared for this moment with ruthless cunning. Soldiers screamed, some clutching wounds, others dragging their comrades to cover that barely existed, and for a heartbeat it seemed the unit would shatter, collapsing into the chaos like fragile glass. But she was already moving, the calm serpent in the storm, her rifle cracking with lethal precision as she sprinted forward, drawing fire to herself without hesitation. She barked orders, her voice low but commanding, cutting through terror like the steady rhythm of a war drum. Flank left, 3 with me. Suppress right side, keep their heads down. You, lay smoke now. The colonel tried to rally the unit, but even he knew that in this moment she was the axis upon which their survival turned. She crawled, rolled, and rose with impossible timing, her shots silencing gun nests one after another, her instincts predicting enemy movements as if she could read their minds. The unit responded, fear turning to focus as they clung to her lead, laying fire, moving in pairs, advancing with a cohesion that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. Still, the militia had numbers in the ground, and casualties mounted as bullets cut through the night. The wounded cried out, the air filled with smoke and the metallic stench of blood, but Black Viper was relentless, her movements fluid, her face a mask of icy determination. She charged a machine gun nest alone, sliding into its blind spot with inhuman speed, her blade flashing once before silence replaced its roar, then turned the captured gun on its former masters, raining fire that cleared a path for the others. The soldiers who had once mocked her now followed her without thought, their trust complete, for they had seen her do what no ordinary soldier could, and in her fearlessness they found the courage to push forward. Hours blurred together in that final ambush, the night seeming endless, but bit by bit they carved through the enemy's ranks, trading blood for inches until at last the clearing was theirs, littered with the fallen, echoing with the groans of survivors. When the shooting finally ceased, when silence pressed heavy against their ears, the unit was no longer the same. They had lost more of their own and grief cut deep, but they also understood they had been forged into something harder, something sharper, under her shadow. The colonel stood among them, his uniform torn, his face streaked with dirt and blood, and he looked at her not as an officer looks at a subordinate but as a man who had seen something both terrifying and awe-inspiring. He gave no speech for none was needed, but when he met her eyes, he gave the smallest of nods, a gesture of respect that weighed more than any words. Yet she did not seek his acknowledgement, nor the gratitude of those who now looked at her as if she were both savior and myth. Her gaze was already on the horizon, cold, calculating, as though measuring the next shadow, the next strike, the next silence where death might wait. The unit gathered their wounded, counted their dead, and marched at last toward the true Allied lines, their steps heavy but unbroken. Along the way whispers spread again, not the cruel laughter of before but the murmurs of reverence, of soldiers speaking her code name with the weight it deserved. Black Viper. They understood now why she had carried herself with such stillness, why she had endured their scorn without flinching, because in her world, their opinions were nothing compared to survival, and survival demanded patience sharper than pride. When they reached safety at last, when the gates opened and relief washed over them, she did not celebrate, did not smile. She cleaned her rifle, replaced her gear, and disappeared into the silence she carried with her, leaving the others to realize that legends did not linger for gratitude. They moved on, waiting for the next shadow. And though she walked among them, ate with them, slept in the same barracks, she was already apart again, a serpent coiled in silence, watching, waiting, reminding them that she was never truly theirs. She belonged to the dark and to the wars that would never end. The return to base should have been the end of their ordeal, a chance for weary bodies to rest and minds to shed the weight of days soaked in blood, yet the gates that closed behind them did not seal away the war, for war had already sunk its claws into their souls. The unit was greeted with the somber salutes of their comrades, the respectful silence of officers who understood the price carved into their eyes, and the whispers of others who stared at the woman in their midst as if looking at a ghost made flesh. The codename had spread faster than any official report, carried through radio operators, hushed conversations, and the loose tongues of those who had seen glimpses of her in the firefight. Black Viper, they murmured, and in those two words was awe, fear, and the weight of stories half believed until now. Soldiers who had once dismissed her now avoided her gaze, not out of disdain but reverence, for to look into her eyes was to feel the distance between their struggles and hers. The colonel reported their survival, their casualties, the intelligence gathered, but when he spoke of her, his voice held an edge of something rare, respect tempered by unease. Without her, he told the high command, we would have been slaughtered to the last man. Yet for all the praise she remained as she always had, silent, unshaken, her expression unreadable. The barracks, once filled with laughter and careless boasting, became quiet around her. Men who had once jostled her now gave way in silence, and recruits who once mocked whispered questions about her past, though none dared ask her directly. Rumors multiplied, stories painting her as everything from a government experiment to a phantom assassin, and though none knew the truth, the fear in their voices spoke of the legend already carved into her name. But the base was no sanctuary, for only days after their return, new orders arrived. Orders so urgent that even the colonel's face tightened with unease. The militia they had fought was not an isolated force. It was the limb of a larger beast, an insurgent network spreading like wildfire across the region, armed with weapons too advanced to have been acquired without powerful backers. Their next mission would not be survival in the wilderness but a strike at the heart of this network, a mission so dangerous it bordered on suicidal. The colonel gathered the unit in the briefing hall, maps projected on the wall, his voice hard as stone as he outlined the plan. Infiltration of a fortified compound hidden deep in hostile territory, a place where intelligence suggested both enemy leadership and their weapons cache were concentrated. Failure meant not just their deaths but the collapse of security in the entire region. Murmurs rippled through the ranks, fear cloaked as questions, doubts spoken in careful tones, but when her name was mentioned, when Black Viper was designated as the one to lead the infiltration team, the room fell silent. No one questioned it. No one dared. If survival had a face, it was hers. Still, within that silence was a weight none of them admitted. To follow her meant stepping willingly into a mission where the chance of return was nearly nothing. She accepted without hesitation, her eyes fixed on the map, her voice calm as she asked only about escape routes and supply drops. No protest, no bravado, only the cold calculation of one who had done this before, who had walked into the jaws of death and returned when others had not. That night, while others packed with trembling hands, she sat alone, stripping her rifle with methodical precision, her silence unbroken even as soldiers passed her bunk with furtive glances. Some wanted to thank her for saving their lives, some wanted to ask how she carried the weight of so much death, but none found the courage to break the barrier of her stillness. To them she was untouchable, a shadow that moved in human form, and though she shared their space, she was never truly with them. Yet even shadows leave impressions, and the younger recruits, who had once been the cruelest in their mockery, now mimicked her discipline, her focus, their hands steadier because they had seen hers never falter. When the day came to depart, dawn painting the sky in muted gold, the unit marched with grim faces, their packs heavy not just with weapons but with the knowledge that this mission could be their last. Helicopters lifted them into the sky, the roar of rotors drowning out unspoken fears, and as the ground fell away beneath them, eyes turned to her once more. She sat calm, expressionless, the storm of war already moving in her gaze, and though no words passed between them, they drew strength from her presence, as if her silence alone could shield them from the fire ahead. In their hearts, they knew, the legend of Black Viper was no myth, no rumor, it was the reality they lived under, and it would carry them into the dark once more. The helicopters dropped them miles from the target under cover of night, the blades cutting through the wind like a heartbeat that slowed the moment the earth swallowed them again, leaving behind only silence and the looming presence of the forest that stretched toward the enemy compound. The unit moved quickly, their gear tight against their bodies, every step measured, every breath restrained, for they knew the ground ahead was watched, and the wrong sound could mean discovery. She led them as always, her movements so fluid that even in darkness her body seemed to blend with the terrain, guiding them with small gestures, halting them when her instincts caught dangers no one else could sense, pointing out tripwires hidden under leaves, sensors half buried in the mud, and the faint glow of enemy patrols in the distance. Hours passed as they weaved through the labyrinth of danger, the soldiers behind her moving with a unity they had never possessed before, their fear tempered by the knowledge that her silence was their shield. When at last the compound came into view, their breath caught in their throats. It was no simple encampment but a fortress carved into the forest, with steel walls reinforced by guard towers, floodlights sweeping in cold arcs, and the constant hum of generators powering whatever horrors lay within. Guards patrolled in overlapping patterns, their discipline sharper than the militia they had faced before, their weapons sleek and advanced, proof of a powerful hand supplying them. For a moment doubt flared again in the unit's minds, how could they possibly breach this? But then her hand lifted, signaling silence, and she crouched low, studying the enemy movements with the unblinking patience of a predator. Minutes stretched, then hours, until at last she whispered, her voice so low it was almost a breath. 2 towers west side. Blind spot between sweeps. That's our entry. There was no hesitation in her tone, no uncertainty, and the colonel gave the order to move. The approach was agonizing, every heartbeat thundering in their ears as they crawled through mud, pressed against the ground while floodlights passed inches over their heads, their rifles slick with sweat in trembling hands. But she was a shadow ahead of them, cutting the path with surgical strikes. One guard silenced with a knife before he could turn, another dragged into darkness with barely a sound. By the time the unit reached the wall, their hearts pounding, the path she had carved was clear. They scaled the steel with ropes, slipping over the top into the compound itself, their boots landing in a world where every step was peril. Inside, the compound was alive with activity, trucks moving crates of ammunition, radio chatter echoing from tents, guards crisscrossing paths in tight formations. But under her lead, they moved like wraiths, weaving through the maze undetected. Their mission was clear. Locate the command center, gather intelligence on leadership, and destroy the weapons cache before retreating. Failure was not an option. Yet as they advanced deeper, the truth of the enemy revealed itself. The crates they passed were not filled with rifles or grenades but advanced weapons far beyond what a militia should wield: missiles, encrypted comms, surveillance drones, all stamped with markings that hinted at foreign suppliers. The colonel's face tightened with anger, but her expression did not change. To her, it was no surprise. She had seen shadows like these before, nations fueling proxy wars with blood not their own. At last they reached the inner compound, where a reinforced bunker pulsed with light and the sound of machinery. This was the heart of the beast. She signaled positions with swift hand gestures, assigning fire teams, placing snipers, and leading the breach herself. Explosives were planted, charges set, and when the blast ripped through the night, the unit surged forward in a storm of fire and steel. What followed was chaos, a battle fought in tight corridors where every corner could hide death, where muzzle flashes lit faces twisted in desperation, and where the silence of their infiltration gave way to the roar of war. She was everywhere at once, her rifle an extension of her will, her blade flashing in the dark when bullets ran low, her commands snapping through the noise to pull her soldiers back from the edge of collapse. The enemy fought savagely, but against her precision their resistance faltered. By the time they stormed the command room, the enemy leader lay on the floor, his final breath cut short by the woman they had once mocked, and in his files the truth was laid bare. Alliances with powerful foreign backers, plans for destabilization stretching across borders, a war that would not end here but was only beginning. They downloaded the intel, planted charges on the weapons caches, and pulled back as fire consumed the compound behind them, explosions lighting the night sky in a brutal sunrise of destruction. The mission was a success, but as they fled into the forest once more, pursued by the remnants of the enemy, the soldiers felt no triumph, only the sobering weight of what they had uncovered. And at the center of it all was her, Black Viper, moving with the same cold calm, her eyes already distant, as if the burning fortress was not the end of a battle but merely another step deeper into the endless war she had always known. The forest swallowed them once more, its branches clawing at their gear as they fled from the inferno they had unleashed, the night alive with the echo of distant gunfire and the pounding boots of enemy survivors giving chase. Their lungs burned, their muscles screamed, but they did not falter, for behind them the compound burned with the fury of a dying beast, its explosions lighting the sky and guiding pursuers to their trail. The unit moved in silence, every step a struggle against exhaustion, the weight of stolen intel heavier than their packs, and yet she remained at the front, her movements as measured as ever, her eyes scanning the shadows for threats long before they appeared. Hours stretched like days until the forest thinned into open marshland, and there the enemy struck again, ambushes rising from the reeds with sudden fury, bullets hissing through the air like vipers of their own. The unit returned fire, desperation lending strength to their trembling hands, but it was she who turned the tide, moving with the same ruthless precision that had carried them through every battle. Her rifle spoke in short, controlled bursts, each shot a life ended, each strike a hole punched into the enemy's line, and when ammunition ran low, her blade took over, silent, merciless, leaving bodies behind like broken branches. The colonel fought at her side, his voice raw as he barked commands, but even he could not deny that the true rhythm of the battle was hers. They pushed through, leaving the marsh littered with the fallen, but their numbers were dwindling, the wounded slowing them, the dead weighing on their souls. By the time they reached the extraction point, dawn was bleeding across the horizon, painting the sky in colors that felt too soft for the carnage behind them. Helicopters thundered overhead, ropes uncoiling, voices shouting for them to climb, and as the unit scrambled aboard, their bodies collapsing into the safety they had clawed from the jaws of death, she remained on the ground, her rifle aimed at the treeline, covering them until the last soldier was aboard. Only then did she sling her weapon, climb the rope with steady strength, and disappear into the belly of the bird as it lifted away, leaving the battlefield behind. The flight back was heavy with silence, the kind born not of fear but of reverence, every eye on her as she sat apart, her face unreadable, her hands methodically cleaning the blood from her blade. None spoke to her, for words felt too small, too fragile, in the presence of one who had carried them through hell itself. The colonel finally broke the silence, his voice low but carrying across the cabin. "You've given these soldiers more than survival. You've shown them what it means to be more than men and women in uniform. You've shown them what it means to be unbreakable." She looked at him only once, her expression as cold as ever, and said nothing. For she knew what they did not, that unbreakable did not mean untouched, that her silence was not strength alone but the weight of ghosts that followed her, unseen, unspoken. When they returned to base, the survivors were hailed as heroes, their mission debriefed, their intel secured, their losses mourned with the honors of soldiers who had given their lives for something greater. Yet through all the ceremonies, all the praise, she remained distant, her name spoken in whispers, her presence a shadow at the edge of every celebration. For them, this was the end of a nightmare. For her, it was only another step in a path that would never end. In the weeks that followed, the unit healed, trained, and prepared for the next mission. But they were not the same soldiers who had once mocked her. They carried her lessons in their every movement, their every decision sharpened by the memory of her silence in the storm. They spoke of her in barracks and mess halls, their stories spreading until even those who had never seen her in battle treated her name with reverence. Black Viper. The legend had grown beyond her, larger than the woman herself, a story that would outlive them all. Yet she carried it without pride, without comfort, only with the same cold patience that had always defined her. For she knew that legends did not belong to those who bore them. They belonged to those who needed them, and soldiers needed stories of shadows that could not be killed, serpents that struck without warning, protectors who moved unseen. And so she remained in the background, waiting, silent, her eyes always on the next horizon, the next mission, the next war that would swallow her whole. For the world would never stop birthing wars, and as long as there was blood to be spilled and silence to be kept, Black Viper would walk in the shadows, mocked no more, whispered of forever. The end.